To truly understand the void left on the morning of August 13th, one must first understand the constant, vibrant presence that was Shannon Watts. Her life was an open book, chronicled in real time across social media platforms. Her work with the multi-level marketing company Lavelle Thrive wasn't just a job. It was a testament to her personality, effervescent, outgoing, and relentlessly optimistic. The weekend preceding her death was the epitome of that life. She had flown to Arizona for a company event, a whirlwind of team-building exercises, motivational speeches, and reunions with friends and colleagues she considered a second family. Her best friend, Nicole Atkinson, had joined her on the trip. For them, it was a mixture of business and a cherished girls' weekend. In the dozens of videos and photos Shannon posted, she appeared to be at the peak of her powers, confident, radiant, and excited about the future, particularly the impending arrival of her first son. Yet beneath the polished surface of her public persona, a current of private anxiety had begun to run. During quiet moments in Arizona, she confided in Nicole. Chris had been distant, she explained. Something felt off. He wasn't the same affectionate husband he had been. Shannon, ever the optimist, was determined to fix it, believing that once she was home, things would return to normal. She had purchased a book on relationship building and was hopeful it could bridge the growing emotional gap between them. The journey home was fraught with delays. Her original flight was canceled, forcing her onto a later one that didn't land in Denver until well after midnight. Nicole was there to pick her up, waiting patiently as the hours ticked by. Their drive from Denver International Airport to Frederick was the last conversation Shannon would have with a friend. In the enclosed space of the car, traveling through the dark, deserted highways, she spoke more of her concerns. Chris seemed to be pulling away not just from her, but from the children as well. It was a puzzle she couldn't solve, an emotional equation that didn't add up. At approximately 1:48 a.m. on Monday, August 13th, Nicole Atkinson pulled up to the curb at 2825 Saratoga Trail. She watched as Shannon, tired but grateful to be home, walked up the driveway and through the front door. It was the last time she would ever see her friend alive. The click of the closing door was a sound of finality Nicole could not have possibly understood at the time. Later that morning, the silence began. "I texted her when I woke up around 9, just saying, hey," Nicole would later recount to investigators, her voice a near constant tremor in the recorded interview. "Nothing. A little later I tried again, still nothing. That was the first ping in my head. This is weird." Her concern was amplified by the knowledge of Shannon's 10:00 a.m. doctor's appointment. Shannon had been so excited about it. It was the first appointment where she would be able to hear Nico's heartbeat. There was no conceivable reason for her to miss it. When the doctor's office confirmed Shannon was a no-show, Nicole Atkinson's vague sense of unease solidified into a cold, hard knot of fear. She knew Shannon's passcodes. She tried to log into her friend's Find My Phone app. The location showed the phone was still inside the house. It was then, standing in her own home, miles away, that Nicole became the first unofficial investigator on the case. She didn't have a badge or a warrant, but she had something far more powerful in that moment. The intimate knowledge of her friend's patterns and a gut instinct that was screaming at her that something was catastrophically wrong. She got in her car and drove to Saratoga Trail, a decision that would ultimately force the discovery of a truth far more terrible than she could ever have imagined. The drive to Saratoga Trail was short, but for Nicole Atkinson, every second stretched into an eternity of worst-case scenarios. She pulled her car to the curb in front of her friend's home, her son in the passenger seat beside her. The house looked exactly as it had just 12 hours earlier when she dropped Shannon off. Peaceful, still, betraying no hint of the frantic void that had swallowed its occupants. But Nicole knew that the tranquil facade of a suburban home could mask anything. She walked up the concrete path and rang the doorbell, the chime echoing unnervingly inside the silent house. She waited. Nothing. She rang it again, then began knocking, her taps growing louder, more insistent, bordering on frantic. "Shannon, it's me. Are you in there?" Her voice felt small, absorbed by the immaculately maintained landscaping and the closed doors of the neighboring houses. Her eyes darted around, searching for clues. Shannon's gray Lexus was visible through the garage window, a detail that sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through her. Shannon was a homebody when she wasn't working. If she were home, she would answer. If she had gone somewhere, she would have taken her car. Neither of these truths was playing out. Circling the house, she peered through the ground floor windows, her hands cupped against the glass to block the afternoon glare. She could see into the pristine living room, a space that looked untouched, showroom ready. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned lamps or scattered belongings. But the perfect stillness was, in itself, terrifying. It felt staged. Growing more desperate, she decided she needed to get inside. But how? She tried the front door. It was locked tight. The garage keypad was an option, but she didn't know the code. At this point, the protocol of neighborly concern had been breached. This was an emergency. She decided to call the one person who should be just as worried as she was, Shannon's husband. She dialed Chris Watts's number. When he answered, his voice was inexplicably calm. There was no panic, no urgency. "Chris, it's Nickel," she said, her own voice tight with anxiety. "I can't get a hold of Shannon. She missed her doctor's appointment. I'm at the house, her car is here, but she's not answering the door." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then he offered an explanation that felt instantly, intuitively wrong. He claimed Shannon had taken the girls to a friend's house for a playdate, but he couldn't remember the friend's name. The lie was flimsy, transparent. Shannon wouldn't go on a playdate without her phone, which Nickel knew was still pinging inside the house. And she certainly wouldn't have blown off an important OB/GYN appointment she had been eagerly anticipating. The story was a piece of glass that didn't fit the frame. It shattered the last of Nickel's hope that this was all a misunderstanding. "Chris, that doesn't make any sense," she pressed, her frustration boiling over. "Her car is here. Her phone is here. I'm worried something is wrong." His responses remained vague, unconcerned, evasive. He promised to head home from work, but his casual tone did nothing to soothe her fears. It amplified them. Standing on the sun-baked sidewalk of that quiet street, with her own son watching her with wide, worried eyes, Nickel Atkinson made the decision. Her friend's husband wasn't acting right. The situation was impossible. There was only one thing left to do. With trembling fingers, she dialed the Frederick Police Department and formally requested a welfare check for Shannon Watts and her 2 children. The clock had officially started. For Nickel Atkinson, the wait on the sun-drenched sidewalk of Saratoga Trail was an agony of suspense. Every passing car sent a jolt of hope or dread through her. The quiet, idyllic suburban street, once a symbol of her friend's happy life, now felt menacing, its silence a heavy, suffocating blanket. She had made the call. She had set the official wheels in motion. But now, alone with her thoughts, she was forced to confront the terrible possibilities her mind had been trying so desperately to keep at bay. Soon, a marked Frederick police cruiser turned the corner, its slow, deliberate approach a stark contrast to the chaotic fear churning within her. The car pulled to the curb, and Officer Scott Coonrod stepped out. He was the picture of professional calm, his movements unhurried, his expression neutral. To him, this was, for now, a welfare check, one of the most common and often benign calls a patrol officer receives. As he approached, Nickel's story tumbled out in a frantic, disjointed stream. The uncharacteristic silence from Shannon, the missed doctor's appointment, the car in the garage, the strange and evasive conversation with Chris. Officer Coonrod listened patiently, his training allowing him to sift through the emotional deluge for the hard facts. "Her purse and phone are usually right there on the counter," Nickel explained, gesturing toward the house. "She wouldn't go anywhere without them, and never ever without her girls." Officer Coonrod performed his initial duties with methodical precision. He walked the perimeter of the home, checking for any signs of forced entry, broken windows, gimmed locks. There were none. The house was a fortress, sealed from the outside. To any casual observer, it was a home whose occupants had simply stepped out. But every detail Nickel provided contradicted that simple conclusion. It was at this point, standing in the driveway, that Christopher Watts arrived. He pulled up in his Anadarko work truck, the engine's diesel rumble a sudden, harsh intrusion into the tense quiet. He stepped out of the cab, dressed in his work clothes, and approached Officer Coonrod and Nickel. His face to them registered not as panicked or frantic with worry, but with a strange, almost disconnected placidity. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice even. Officer Coonrod began his questioning, but Nickel's eyes were fixed on Chris. She was watching the man she knew as her friend's husband, searching his face for the shared terror she felt. She found none. He answered the officer's questions, but there was an unsettling lack of urgency in his demeanor. He seemed more like a curious bystander than a man whose entire family had vanished. "When was the last time you saw them, sir?" Officer Coonrod asked. "This morning when I left for work," Chris replied smoothly, launching the first of the many lies he would tell that day. "Around 5:30. To get inside, they needed a key." Chris fumbled in his pockets. I don't have my house key on me," he said, a statement that seemed odd for a homeowner. He suggested the garage door, pulling a remote from his truck's visor. He pointed it at the house and pressed the button. The loud, mechanical groan of the garage door opening was the first sound to break the home's unnatural silence. As the heavy door shuddered upwards, it revealed the dark, cavernous space of the garage, with Shannon's Lexus parked neatly inside. Beyond it, a single door led into the house itself. It was a threshold. Crossing it would transform this from a welfare check into a full-blown missing persons investigation. Officer Coonrod gestured for Chris to lead the way, and together, they stepped out of the bright afternoon sun and into the cold, silent heart of the crime scene. The air inside the house at 2825 Saratoga Trail was cool and still, a stark contrast to the sweltering August afternoon outside. As Officer Coonrod and Chris Watts stepped inside, with a frantic Nickel Atkinson following close behind, the first impression was one of profound and unnerving order. A home occupied by two toddlers, a pregnant mother, and a dog should have a baseline level of happy chaos, a stray toy, a pair of shoes kicked off in the hall, the faint scent of breakfast. This house had none of that. It wasn't just tidy, it felt sterile, a meticulously maintained space from which all life had been abruptly scrubbed. Chris Watts began to walk them through the downstairs rooms, his movements stiff, his narration strangely formal. He was acting less like the master of the house and more like a real estate agent conducting a showing. "This is the living room, the kitchen," he would say, pointing to the obvious. To Officer Coonrod, this detached behavior was an immediate anomaly. People in genuine distress don't narrate the mundane. They search, they call out names, they fall apart. Chris was doing none of those things. They moved through the ground floor, Nickel's dread mounting with every silent room they entered. She pointed out the girls' iPads on the kitchen counter, their beloved EpiPens for their allergies still in their designated spot. Small details a stranger would miss, but to her they were screaming alarms. Then they went upstairs. The officer checked the girls' bedrooms first. Both were immaculate. The beds were neatly made, stuffed animals arranged just so. The sight sent a fresh wave of nausea through Nickel. It was Shannon's morning routine to tidy their beds after they were up. This suggested she had been there that morning, but it didn't explain where she or the girls had gone. The final stop was the master bedroom. The air here felt different, heavier. Officer Coonrod's eyes swept the room, professionally cataloging the scene. Chris stood near the doorway, a ghost in his own life's museum. He offered an observation intended to sound helpful, but which landed with a chilling oddity. "The only thing that's weird," he said, gesturing to the bed, "is the bed's not made." The sheets and comforter were indeed rumpled in disarray on one side, a stark contrast to the rest of the home's perfect order. To a casual observer, it was nothing. To an investigator, it was a point of interest, a single chaotic element in an otherwise pristine environment. But Nickel wasn't looking at the bed. Her eyes were fixed on the nightstand. There, placed with an almost deliberate neatness, was Shannon's cell phone. Beside it, her wallet and her purse. A person might forget one of these items in a rush. To leave all three was unthinkable. And then Nickel's eyes fell upon something small glinting under the lamplight. It was sitting on the nightstand next to the phone. Her wedding ring. At that moment, for Nicole Atkinson, all speculative fear collapsed into a single, horrifying certainty. Shannon would never, under any circumstances, voluntarily take off her wedding ring and leave it behind. It was an extension of her, a symbol of the family life she had so proudly built and projected to the world. To leave it behind was not a sign of a trip. It was a sign of a finality that Nicole could barely bring herself to comprehend. Officer Coonrod saw it too. In his mind, the procedural checkboxes of a welfare check had been replaced by the bold, flashing red flags of a major criminal investigation. The case had now officially crossed a legal threshold. A mother, 15 weeks pregnant, does not vanish without her car, her phone, her money, or the ring on her finger. A mother does not take her 2 young daughters and leave their life-saving medication behind. This was no longer a welfare check. This was a missing persons case under the most suspicious circumstances imaginable. And the only person present who wasn't panicking was the man who should have been the most terrified of all. The sight of the wedding ring, small and glinting on the nightstand, was a silent detonation in the master bedroom. It was a small circle of gold, but for the people in that room, it had the gravitational pull of a black hole, sucking away the last vestiges of hope and normalcy. For Nicole Atkinson, the air was punched from her lungs. All the small, disparate puzzle pieces, the missed appointment, the silent phone, the car in the garage, snapped into a single, terrifying picture. She turned to Officer Coonrod, her voice a choked whisper but with an edge of absolute certainty. She would never take that ring off. Never. It wasn't a guess. It was a statement of irrefutable fact, a character testament from the person who knew the victim best. All eyes in the room, Nichols and Officer Coonrod's, instinctively turned to Chris Watts. This was the moment for a husband to break down. To see the physical symbol of his marriage discarded on a nightstand should have elicited a cry of anguish, a torrent of frantic questions, a collapse. Chris did nothing. He stood there, a spectator in the drama of his own life, his face a placid mask. He offered no explanation, no flicker of emotion. The chasm between the expected reaction and his actual non-reaction was vast and deeply unsettling. For Officer Coonrod, the situation had crystallized. He was no longer a community helper checking on a resident's welfare. He was the first responding officer at a potential major crime scene. His training took over immediately. The integrity of the scene was now paramount. "Folks, I need you both to step downstairs with me, please," he said, his tone shifting from inquisitive to authoritative. He gently but firmly ushered a shell-shocked Nicole and a compliant Chris out of the master bedroom and down the stairs. The home, which they had just been walking through freely, was now officially off-limits. Once downstairs in the living room, Officer Coonrod keyed his radio. His voice was calm and professional, the clipped, formal language of law enforcement a stark contrast to the emotional chaos in the room. "Frederick 1 to dispatch. Go ahead, 1. I'm at 2825 Saratoga Trail on that welfare check. The circumstances are suspicious. I'm going to need a detective supervisor to my location." The radio call was a point of no return. It elevated a simple patrol response into a full-blown criminal investigation. The local police department's top investigators would now be activated. While waiting, Officer Coonrod began the process of separating the parties, a standard procedure. He needed to get a more formal statement from Nicole, and more importantly, he needed to start observing Chris Watts more closely, away from the influence of a distraught friend. Chris sat on his own living room couch, now a subject of police inquiry in his own home. He would occasionally pull out his phone, scroll through it, a gesture of performed normalcy that felt utterly alien in the context of the situation. He was not a grieving husband. He was a man waiting. Nicole, pacing near the front door, was the picture of raw, escalating terror. The cognitive dissonance in the room was palpable, her genuine panic versus his chilling composure. The afternoon sun slanted through the blinds, striping the immaculate carpet. The house was no longer a home. It was a piece of evidence. Every undisturbed object, every silent room, seemed to shout of the violence that had to have taken place. The cavalry was coming. And with them, the full weight of a criminal investigation that would soon focus its intense, unblinking gaze upon the only person left in the house, the quiet, unnervingly calm husband. The arrival of Detective Dave Baumhover marked a distinct shift in the atmosphere on Saratoga Trail. A veteran of the Frederick Police Department, Baumhover had the quiet, observant demeanor of a man who had seen the spectrum of human behavior. He wasn't there to comfort, he was there to dissect. His first stop was with Officer Coonrod, who provided a clipped, concise summary of the situation. A pregnant wife and 2 young children vanished, their essential belongings left behind, and a husband whose calm was so profound it registered as a blaring siren in the minds of the responding officers. Baumhover's initial assessment of Christopher Watts was clinical. He observed the man's body language. There was no hand-wringing, no frantic pacing, no desperate, pleading eyes searching for answers. Chris's posture was relaxed, his gaze steady. In the thousands of death notifications and missing persons cases Baumhover had worked, he had a deep and intuitive understanding of grief, shock, and terror. What he was seeing in Chris Watts was none of those things. It was a performance and not a particularly convincing one. "Mr. Watts, I'm Detective Baumhover," he began, his tone professional but approachable. "Can you walk me through your morning?" Chris agreed, his voice steady. He led the detective back into the house, a house that was now under the invisible but unbreakable seal of a police investigation. He recounted the story he had been rehearsing, a narrative of domestic normalcy that had taken an inexplicable turn. He told Baumhover that he had woken up around 5:15 a.m., prepared for his workday, and had an emotional conversation with Shannon about their marital issues and his desire for a separation. "It was a difficult talk, but it was civil," Chris explained, the words chosen to convey maturity and reasonableness. He claimed that after their conversation, Shannon had been upset but composed, and that was the last time he had seen her. He had left for work, believing she and the girls were still in their beds. As Baumhover listened, he made a mental checklist. The story, on its surface, was plausible. A marital argument followed by a wife taking the kids to cool off somewhere was not, in itself, an unheard-of scenario. But it crumbled under the weight of the physical evidence. Why leave the phone? Why leave the wallet and the medication? Why take the ring off? Every one of Shannon's abandoned possessions was a silent witness refuting his calm, logical story. Baumhover's walkthrough of the house was different from Officer Coonrod's. He moved slowly, his eyes scanning for details that were out of place. He noted the girls' little backpacks by the door, as if ready for an outing. He saw their car seats were still in Shannon's Lexus. The details didn't support the idea of a mother leaving with her children, even in a huff. A mother, no matter how angry, does not compromise her children's safety by traveling without their car seats. Meanwhile, the scene outside was changing. The single patrol car had been joined by another, and now Detective Baumhover's unmarked vehicle. The street was no longer just quiet, it was conspicuous. Neighbors, drawn by the sustained police presence in their normally tranquil subdivision, began to peek through blinds and crack open their front doors. A murmur was beginning to ripple through the community. The perfect facade of Saratoga Trail was beginning to fracture. Inside, Detective Baumhover wasn't just investigating a disappearance. He was assessing a storyteller, and the storyteller's performance was failing. The disconnect between the terrifying reality of a missing pregnant woman and 2 toddlers and the subdued, almost dispassionate demeanor of the husband was a chasm that no plausible explanation could bridge. The initial interview had yielded a narrative, but in the detective's mind, it had also established the prime suspect. The investigation now had a clear, singular focus: to deconstruct the lies of Christopher Watts. The investigation began to move in a methodical outward spiral from the epicenter of 2825 Saratoga Trail. With the house itself yielding nothing but a chilling sense of absence, the focus shifted to the surrounding environment. In modern law enforcement, particularly in a newly built subdivision, one of the first and most crucial steps is a canvas for a specific type of witness: the digital one. Home security cameras, the silent, sleepless sentinels of suburbia, often capture truths that human eyes miss. Detective Baumhover and other officers began a door-to-door canvass of the immediate neighbors. The questions were simple and direct. Did you see or hear anything unusual last night or this morning? Do you have any security cameras? The request was standard operating procedure, but the response from one neighbor, Nate Trinastich, who lived directly across the street, was a potential breakthrough. He not only had a camera, but it was positioned on his garage and had a clear, unobstructed view of the Watts' driveway and the front of their home. For the investigators, this was a moment of immense potential. The most reliable witness is often the one made of silicon and wire, incapable of misremembering, lying, or being intimidated. In what would become a pivotal and surreal moment in the investigation, Chris Watts, still playing the role of the cooperative husband, was invited to join Detective Baumhover and Nate in Trinastich's living room to review the footage. It was a calculated investigative strategy. Allowing a person of interest to watch objective evidence unfold is a powerful way to gauge their reaction, to observe the cracks that might appear in their story when confronted with an undeniable truth. Nate Trinastich queued up the recordings from the previous night and the early morning hours. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy, black and white infrared images of the quiet street. They fast-forwarded through hours of stillness, a passing car, a raccoon scurrying across a lawn. Then at 5:27 a.m. the screen showed movement. It was Chris's work truck. The footage showed the truck, which had been parked on the street, being backed up into his driveway, stopping just short of the garage door. The position was odd, aggressive. It wasn't the way someone would park for a normal departure. On the screen, a figure, clearly Chris, could be seen moving back and forth between the garage and the truck's passenger side doors. He was loading things, but the low resolution and the angle of the camera made it impossible to discern exactly what. He appeared to make several trips. The entire process took about 15 minutes. Then, the truck pulled away and disappeared down the street. Watching his own ghost-like image on the screen, Chris's veneer of calm finally showed its first visible cracks. He began to exhibit nervous energy, shifting his weight, his hands going in and out of his pockets. Before Baumhover could even formulate a question about the strange parking, Chris volunteered an explanation. "Yeah, I was loading my tools and my lunchbox," he said, his voice a little too quick, a little too loud in the quiet living room. "I park on the street so it doesn't block Shannon's car in, but I backed up to make loading the heavy stuff easier this morning." The explanation was plausible on the surface, but to an experienced detective, the preemptive justification was a massive red flag. Innocent people answer questions when they are asked. Guilty people often feel the need to narrate and control the discovery of incriminating evidence. The grainy footage didn't show what he had loaded. It didn't prove a crime had been committed. But what it did prove, unequivocally, was that his morning had not been as normal as he claimed. And his immediate, unprompted need to explain away the abnormality was, for Detective Baumhover, a quiet confession of its own. Inside Nate Trinastich's living room, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that far outweighed the grainy, mundane images on the television screen. Detective Baumhover, a seasoned observer of human behavior, divided his attention. He was watching the footage, yes, but more importantly, he was watching Christopher Watts watch the footage. And Chris's body was screaming what his mouth was trying to conceal. His subtle swaying, the rhythmic shifting of his weight from foot to foot, was a classic sign of internal distress, a physical manifestation of a body trying to release a buildup of nervous energy. He ran his hands over his head and down his face, a self-soothing gesture that belied the calm he was trying to project with his words. These were non-verbal tells, small leaks in the dam of his deception, and Detective Baumhover was cataloging every single one. But it was a comment from Nate Trinastich, spoken in a hushed tone after Chris had stepped out of the room to take a phone call, that truly sharpened the investigator's focus. The quiet neighbor, who had observed the rhythms of Saratoga Trail for months, became the investigation's first de facto behavioral analyst. "You should know," Nate said, leaning closer to Baumhover. "He's not normally like this. Chris is usually a really quiet guy, reserved. You practically have to force a conversation out of him. Today, he's talking nonstop. He's never talked to me this much in the entire time he's lived here, and he's acting so fidgety. Something is very, very wrong." This observation was invaluable. It wasn't just a detective's suspicion. It was a baseline behavioral analysis from a credible, impartial observer. Baumhover now knew that the man he was observing wasn't just nervous because his family was missing. He was acting fundamentally out of character. The persona he was presenting was a fabrication, and a clumsy one at that. Back at the Watts residence, the law enforcement presence was escalating. Under the guise of a comprehensive search for the missing family, the Frederick Police Department, now bolstered by agents from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, was beginning the methodical process of transforming the home from a potential crime scene into a confirmed one. They were acting under a signed consent to search form from Chris, a legal document he had willingly provided, still clinging to his role as the helpful, concerned husband. This consent allowed investigators to do more than just a cursory walkthrough. They could now open drawers, look in closets, and meticulously document the state of every room. While one team handled the physical search, another was already in the process of drafting search warrants for a far more revealing set of evidence. Cell phone records, location data, and financial transactions for both Chris and Shannon. In the sterile world of data, they hoped to find the answers the pristine house was refusing to give up. A person's digital life often tells a truer story than the physical one they curate. Investigators began the formal requests to telecommunication companies, a bureaucratic but essential step that would, they hoped, illuminate the 24 hours leading up to the disappearances, and more critically, pinpoint where Chris Watts had actually been that morning. As the sun began to set on that first chaotic day, a profound sense of dread was settling over the investigative team. They knew, with a certainty that was growing by the minute, that they were not searching for three people who had wandered off. They were at the very beginning of a homicide investigation, and their primary suspect, a man whose lies were becoming more transparent by the hour, was still walking freely among them. As dusk settled over Frederick, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns of Saratoga Trail, the investigation entered a new, more urgent phase. The 24-hour mark since Shannon was last seen alive was approaching, a critical threshold in any missing persons case, particularly one involving young children. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation made it official. They issued a missing endangered alert for Shannon Watts and her two daughters. Their faces, smiling in happy family photos, were now broadcast across the state, their images flashing on highway signs and appearing on news broadcasts, a stark public declaration that a private tragedy was unfolding. The media, drawn by the unsettling nature of the case, began to descend on the quiet suburban neighborhood. News vans with their towering satellite antennas parked along the street, their presence a stark intrusion into the carefully constructed tranquility of the subdivision. The story was compelling and terrifying in its relatability. A beautiful, pregnant mother and her two adorable children had vanished from their picture-perfect home. It was a narrative that tapped into the deepest fears of suburban America. Amidst this burgeoning media storm, Christopher Watts made a decision that would later be scrutinized from every possible angle. He agreed to give an on-camera interview to a local Denver news station. From a law enforcement perspective, this was a high-risk, high-reward moment. A genuinely distraught family member might issue a plea that could generate a crucial tip. A guilty party, however, often uses such an opportunity to perform, to attempt to control the narrative, and in doing so, reveals far more than they intend. Standing on his own front porch, illuminated by the harsh glare of a single television camera light, Chris faced the reporter. Detective Dave Baumhover and other officers observed from a discreet distance, turning the impromptu press conference into a valuable real-time behavioral analysis session. "It's not something I could ever fathom would happen in my lifetime," Chris began, his voice a practiced monotone of sorrow. and I have no inclination of where she would go." He looked directly into the camera, his eyes dry, and delivered his now infamous plea. "Shannon, Bella, Celeste, if you're out there, just come back. Like if somebody has her, just please bring her back. I need to see everybody. I need to see everybody again. This house is not complete without anybody here." For many viewers at home, the image was heart-wrenching. They saw a young father, shattered and lost, bravely appealing for the return of his stolen world. But for the investigators watching him, the performance was riddled with red flags. His emotional display, or lack thereof, was deeply unsettling. He used the past tense, saying she was an amazing mother, a subtle slip that detectives are trained to notice. His body language was rigid, his expressions forced. There were no tears, no raw, uncontrolled bursts of grief, none of the authentic markers of a person experiencing unimaginable trauma. Most chillingly, he smiled faintly when he spoke of his daughters. It was a fleeting, inappropriate flash of an expression, a flicker of something that was not sadness. In the cold, analytical minds of the investigators, his performance on that porch did not read as the plea of a desperate victim. It read as the hollow, scripted monologue of a perpetrator trying to play one. The television interview, intended to cast him as a sympathetic figure, had the exact opposite effect on the people who mattered most. It hardened their suspicion into a near certainty. Tuesday morning arrived with a cool, deceptive brightness that did nothing to dispel the grim atmosphere settling over the investigation. In the makeshift command post that had been established at the Frederick Police Department, the porch interview from the previous night was being replayed. The footage dissected not for its emotional content, but for its profound lack of it. To the seasoned eyes of the CBI profilers and detectives who had dedicated their lives to reading the subtleties of human deceit, Chris Watts's performance was not a plea. It was a confession, veiled in the thinnest layer of feigned grief. "Look at the language," one CBI agent noted, pointing to the screen. "I need to see everybody again." It's self-centered. A grieving parent's focus is on the missing, on their safety. His focus is on his own need. It's all I, me, mine. The consensus was unanimous. The interview was a fatal, unforced error. In his attempt to project the image of a heartbroken victim, Chris had inadvertently revealed himself as the prime suspect to the very people he was trying to mislead. The investigation now moved with a new and hardened resolve. The strategy was two-pronged. While Chris Watts performed for the cameras and maintained his cooperative facade, a different, more powerful narrative was being written by court orders and subpoenas. The search warrants drafted the day before were now in full effect. A team of digital forensic experts, working in sterile labs far from Saratoga Trail, began the painstaking process of extracting data. They targeted the digital trinity of a modern investigation: telecommunications, financial records, and GPS. Chris's personal cell phone, Shannon's phone, and most critically, the telematics data from his Anadarko work truck were now the primary focus. They were searching for a digital ghost, a trail of electronic breadcrumbs that could lead them to a physical location. Simultaneously, detectives were building a psychological profile of the marriage itself. The carefully curated, love-filled image projected on social media was one reality, but investigators knew that behind the screen often lay another. They conducted extensive interviews with Shannon's closest circle. Friends like Nicole Atkinson were spoken to again, this time with a more pointed line of questioning. They spoke with Shannon's mother, Sandra Arzusek, over the phone and with other out-of-state family and friends. A consistent theme began to emerge. The marriage was not perfect. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Shannon had confided in several people that Chris had become distant, emotionally detached, and that she was worried about the future of their relationship. This directly contradicted the perfect family image and the narrative of a simple, civil conversation about separation that Chris was peddling. Every friend's account of Shannon's recent anxieties was another brick being laid in the wall of evidence against her husband. And through it all, Christopher Watts remained the picture of pliant cooperation, a strategy likely born of a narcissist's supreme confidence in his own ability to deceive. He answered follow-up calls from detectives, agreed to come to the station for more questioning if needed, all while seemingly oblivious to the massive digital and human intelligence operation that was methodically encircling him. He was a man standing on a trap door, unaware that dozens of hands were working to pull the lever. The investigators were no longer looking for clues. They were gathering the evidence they would need for an arrest. They were just waiting for a single critical piece of data that could turn the entire landscape of the investigation on its head. A series of coordinates, a timestamp, and a location. They were waiting for his truck to tell them the truth. Wednesday, August 15th. The investigation was now a relentless, 24-hour-a-day machine. At the Frederick Police Department, a large room had been converted into a command center, its walls covered in maps, timelines, and photographs of the smiling family. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low hum of computer servers. The initial chaos of the first 48 hours had subsided, replaced by the grim, methodical rhythm of a major case. Detectives, CBI agents, and now analysts from the FBI moved with a shared, unspoken purpose. They were no longer just collecting information. They were hunting. While the physical world had offered no immediate answers, the digital one was beginning to yield its secrets. The formal requests for data sent out on Monday and Tuesday had been fast-tracked, propelled by the urgency of the missing endangered alert. It was a painstaking process of digital archaeology, sifting through a universe of data points for a single, significant signal. Then, it arrived. An email from the Security and Logistics Department at Anadarko Petroleum. Attached was a spreadsheet, a clinical and unfeeling document containing the raw telematics data from truck 218813, the vehicle assigned to Christopher Watts. It was a precise, minute-by-minute log of the truck's movements on Monday, August 13th. An analyst plotted the coordinates on a digital map. The initial part of the journey matched Chris's story, leaving Saratoga Trail in the pre-dawn hours. But then, a stark deviation appeared. Chris had told Detective Baumhover he had driven straight to his first assigned worksite, a location far to the north. The GPS data told a different story. At 6:13 a.m., the truck's engine was shut off. Its location was not a scheduled worksite. Instead, it was an isolated oil battery deep in the grasslands of Weld County, a site known in the cold, industrial nomenclature of the oil fields as Survey 319. It was a remote, sprawling location, miles from any main road, accessible only by a dirt track. It was a place you went to for a specific reason, not a place you passed by. The investigators gathered around the monitor, their eyes fixed on the blinking cursor that marked the location. The data was more damning than just a simple detour. It showed the truck remained stationary at Survey 319, its engine off, for a full 45 minutes, an eternity on a busy Monday morning. He didn't arrive at his actual first worksite until much later, a timeline that now seemed inexplicably delayed. In the command room, the discovery was an electrifying moment, a grim, silent eureka. This was the geographical anchor they had been desperately searching for. Chris Watts's narrative of a normal workday was not just a lie. It was a lie that now had a specific time and a set of coordinates attached to it. His story was a fiction, and the GPS was the nonfiction that disproved it. "That's it," CBI agent Tammy Lee stated, her voice a mixture of conviction and cold dread. "That's our spot. Why else would he go there? Why would he turn his truck off for 45 minutes in the middle of nowhere?" The questions were rhetorical. Everyone in the room knew the likely answer. The abstract, boundless search area had just shrunk to a single, desolate patch of industrial land. The focus of the investigation was no longer on if Chris Watts was involved. It was on what he had done at Survey 319. With this single, irrefutable piece of evidence in their possession, the entire strategy shifted. They were no longer gathering passive intelligence. It was time to force a confrontation. It was time to call Christopher Watts and ask him to come in for another talk. This time, they would be armed not with suspicion, but with the cold, hard truth of a satellite. The phone call to Christopher Watts was a masterpiece of casual understatement. There was no accusation in Detective Baumhover's voice, no hint of the seismic shift that had just occurred in the investigation. His tone was relaxed, almost mundane, the kind one uses for a routine follow-up. "Hey Chris, it's Detective Baumhover. We're just continuing to run down a few things. We were wondering if you'd be willing to come down to the station, maybe clear up a few points and answer some more questions for us. It could really help." On the other end of the line, Chris agreed without a moment's hesitation. "Yeah, of course. Anything I can do to help find them," he replied, his voice a steady, convincing performance of concern. It was a display of either profound innocence or, more likely, a profound arrogance, the hubris of a killer convinced he has constructed an unbreakable alibi. He was a wolf walking willingly into a hunter's snare, completely unaware that the jaws had been built from his own digital trail. Back at the command center, the strategy for this final confrontation was carefully orchestrated. The plan was not simply to interview him, but to systematically dismantle his reality. They wouldn't lead with the GPS data. That was their ace in the hole, to be played only when necessary. The opening move would be a request for a polygraph examination. The polygraph, while often inadmissible as evidence in court, is one of the most powerful psychological tools in an investigator's arsenal. It's a structured confrontation, an interrogation wrapped in the quasi-scientific authority of a machine. For an innocent person, it's a chance to prove their truthfulness. For a guilty one, it's a direct challenge to their carefully constructed fiction, a mechanical judge that threatens to expose the lies their body is telling even when their mouth does not. The machine itself is the crowbar used to pry open a confession. Chris arrived at the Frederick Police Department late that afternoon. He walked into the station under his own power, an unescorted citizen there to help the police. He was led past the main desk and into the quieter, more secure part of the building, into a small, soundproofed and deliberately bare interview room. There were no pictures on the walls, no windows to the outside world, no distractions, only truth and consequence. Waiting for him was not a Frederick detective, but a specialist brought in from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. CBI polygraph examiner Mike Montes was a master of his craft, a man whose entire career was dedicated to reading the subtle tells of the human body under the duress of a lie, the minute change in perspiration, the fractional increase in heart rate, the imperceptible catch in the breath. Chris sat down, still outwardly composed, as examiner Montes explained the procedure. He was calm, clinical, explaining that the test was entirely voluntary. He attached the various sensors to Chris's body, the blood pressure cuff to his arm, the pneumographs around his chest and abdomen to measure his breathing, the galvanometers to his fingertips to track perspiration. Each wire, each sensor was a new thread in the net being woven around him. The game of deception was entering its final, decisive round. He was no longer a person of interest being questioned. He was the subject of an instrument designed to strip away his lies, one physiological response at a time. The polygraph examination began not with accusations, but with a carefully structured and deceptively benign process of calibration. Examiner Montes's voice was a calm, steady monotone, a technique designed to establish a baseline of normalcy, to relax the subject into a state where any deviation would be glaring. "Is your full name Christopher Lee Watts?" Montes asked. "Yes," Chris replied. The needles on the machine registered a calm, steady line. "Are the lights in this room currently on?" "Yes." Another steady line. These were known truth questions, allowing Montes to see what Chris's physiological output looked like when he was being completely honest about an irrefutable fact. Next came the known lie questions, equally innocuous but psychologically crucial. "Before today, have you ever told even a single lie to get out of trouble?" The question is designed for the subject to answer no, which is almost universally a lie, allowing the examiner to see the physiological signature of a falsehood. With the machine and the subject calibrated, Montes transitioned to the heart of the matter. The room, which had felt professional and almost clinical, now took on the charged atmosphere of a confessional. The questions were no longer about the lights in the room, they were about life and death. Monty's voice remained a placid, even stream, but the words he spoke were hammer blows. "Do you know the physical location of your wife, Shannon, right now?" "No," Chris said, his voice quiet but firm. The polygraph's needles, however, did not remain quiet. They leaped, scribbling a frantic, jagged pattern across the graph, a violent, instantaneous protest from his autonomic nervous system. "Did you have any physical involvement in the disappearance of your wife?" "No." Another frantic jump, a spike in his heart rate, a telltale bead of sweat detected on his fingertip. "Are you concealing any information about what happened to Bella and Celeste?" "No." A catastrophic, undeniable spike. His body was screaming the truth that his lips were denying. It was a complete physiological meltdown. His answers were lies, and the machine was broadcasting that fact with the irrefutable certainty of a cardiogram reading a heart attack. The formal test concluded. Monty's removed the sensors, the silence in the small room amplifying the sound of the Velcro ripping free. Chris sat still, a man waiting for a verdict he already knew. The facade of science was dropped. Examiner Monty's leaned forward slightly, making eye contact. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a calm, final statement of fact. "The test is over, Chris," Monty's began, his voice still low but now imbued with the full weight of his conclusion. "And I'll be honest with you, the results were not good. In fact, on the key questions you showed extreme deception. It was a catastrophic failure." He let the words hang in the air, a final, unassailable wall that Chris had just run into at full speed. "Your body," Monty's continued, "is telling me a completely different story than your words are. Something happened to your family. And you know what that something is." In that moment, under the weight of that quiet, methodical accusation, the confident mask of Christopher Watts, the cooperative husband, the concerned father, finally began to disintegrate. There was no indignant denial, no outburst of protest. There was only a profound, leaden silence. He broke eye contact, his head sinking, his gaze falling to the sterile floor. The game was up. He hadn't just been outmaneuvered, he had been scientifically unmasked. He was a man with nowhere left to lie. The polygraph examiner's verdict, catastrophic failure, did not just hang in the air of the small interview room. It seemed to solidify, becoming an impassable barrier between Christopher Watts and the lies he had so carefully constructed. His world, which had been a sprawling landscape of deception, had now shrunk to the size of the small, featureless room. He sat motionless, his head bowed, the very picture of defeat. The silence was absolute, a vacuum where his crumbling alibi had once been. After a few calculated moments, the door opened. It was not Examiner Monty's who re-entered, but Agent Tammy Lee of the CBI and FBI Special Agent Grom Coder. Their entrance was deliberate, their expressions a carefully calibrated mixture of solemnity and something approaching empathy. The interrogation was entering its next and most critical phase. The scientific approach had served its purpose, it had broken the subject. Now it was time for the psychological one. They didn't sit opposite him as adversaries. They angled their chairs, breaking the confrontational geometry of the room. Their approach was not to attack, but to offer a lifeline. "Chris," Agent Lee began, her voice soft, devoid of accusation, "we know you're not a bad man. We know you love your family. But sometimes people get pushed into a corner. Sometimes terrible things happen that were never meant to happen." It was a classic interrogation technique, providing the subject with a theme or a moral out, a more palatable, less monstrous version of the story they could latch onto. They weren't accusing him of being a cold-blooded killer. They were suggesting he was a good man who had been caught in a tragic, terrible moment. Agent Coder took a different, more spiritual tack. His tone was that of a counselor, a confessor. "This thing is eating you up inside, Chris. I can see it. It's a darkness that you are carrying all on your own. Shannon is in a better place now. Your girls are in a better place. They're with God. But you are the one who is left here, carrying this burden." He spoke of faith, of redemption, of the peace that could come from finally unburdening his soul of this terrible secret. This dual-pronged psychological approach was relentless. It was an offering of understanding from Lee and an offering of spiritual absolution from Coder. They were not interrogating him about facts. They were appealing to a humanity they hoped still existed somewhere within him. And Chris, broken and cornered, began to respond, not with words but with his body. A single tear traced a path down his cheek. His breathing grew ragged. The dam was beginning to crack. It was at this precise moment that Agent Coder made the most critical legal pivot of the entire investigation. He knew they were no longer having a conversation with a cooperative witness. They were speaking to a man on the precipice of a confession. "Chris, before we go any further, I have to do this, okay? It's just procedure," Coder said, his voice remaining gentle as he pulled a small, laminated card from his wallet. He began to read, the formal, staccato words of the Miranda warning cutting through the emotional haze of the room. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He was no longer Chris Watts' helpful husband. He was now officially a suspect in a custodial interrogation. After reading the full warning, Coder asked the crucial question, "Understanding these rights, are you willing to talk to us now?" With a choked, almost inaudible voice, Chris Watts nodded. "Yes," he whispered. He had waived his rights. The legal shield was down, he was defenseless. But instead of confessing, he made a final, desperate plea for a different kind of shield. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and pleading, and asked a question that would lead to the first, twisted version of his story. "Is it possible for me to talk to my dad?" Christopher Watts's request to see his father was a profound psychological tell. In the crucible of the interrogation room, stripped bare by the polygraph and cornered by the gentle, relentless pressure from the agents, his adult psyche had fractured. He was no longer a husband, a father, or a killer. In that moment, he had regressed to the state of a child, seeking the one authority figure he believed could mediate his impossible reality. For Agents Lee and Coder, the request was a high-stakes gamble. Bringing a family member into an interrogation is a tactic of last resort, a volatile and unpredictable maneuver. The upside was immense. A parent's presence can often be the final emotional lever needed to break a subject's resolve, creating a sense of safety that encourages a full confession. The downside was equally catastrophic. The parent could immediately advise their son to stop talking and demand a lawyer, shutting down the interview permanently. The calculus was swift. They had already obtained the Miranda waiver. Chris was still willing to talk, but he was at a fragile tipping point. Pushing him further without this concession might cause him to retreat into a hard shell of silence. They decided to take the risk. They believed the raw emotional power of a father-son confrontation would be their most potent weapon yet. While Agent Lee stayed with Chris, a call was placed to Ronnie Watts. The message was urgent but vague. "Your son has been with us for a while, and he has asked to speak with you." Ronnie, a man caught in the agonizing limbo of a missing daughter-in-law and 2 grandchildren, rushed to the station, likely assuming his son was a victim, a pillar of strength who was finally beginning to crack under the strain. The scene that greeted him at the Frederick Police Department was not what he expected. There was no communal waiting area filled with supportive officers. He was escorted quietly down a long, sterile hallway, the linoleum floors reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights, and led to the very same small, windowless room where his son's lies had been systematically unraveled. The door opened. Chris looked up, his face a swollen, tear-streaked mess. Ronnie's face, etched with a combination of fatherly concern and profound confusion, searched his son's for answers. The 2 agents quietly exited the room, leaving a small recording device running. The door clicked shut, sealing father and son in a bubble of raw, unfiltered emotion. "Oh, son," Ronnie began, his voice thick with a weary sadness as he sat down opposite Chris. "What is going on? What happened?" Chris collapsed into a torrent of uncontrolled sobs, the sounds muffled against his hands. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the desperate, gasping grief of a man who had held everything in for 3 days. I messed up, Dad," Chris choked out between sobs. "I messed up so bad." Ronnie listened, his posture paternal and comforting, urging his son to tell him what was wrong, to unburden himself. He was still in the dark, a father trying to help his son navigate a terrible tragedy. Finally, Chris lifted his head, his eyes meeting his father's. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind a person takes before diving into dark, cold water. He had made a decision. He would confess, but it would not be to the truth. It would be to a story, a monstrous, self-serving fiction designed to mitigate his own evil by making his murdered wife the villain. The first version of his confession was about to be born. It happened after I told her I wanted to separate, Chris Watts began, his voice raspy and broken as he spoke to his father. The confession, when it finally started to spill out, was not a flood of truth but a carefully constructed, malignant narrative. It was the story of a victim, a man driven to an unthinkable act by the monstrous behavior of his wife. He laid the foundation slowly, painting a picture of a turbulent marriage, framing Shannon not as the vibrant, loving mother the world saw, but as a controlling figure from whom he felt he needed to escape. He described the emotional conversation on the morning of August